A poor cowboy wandered through the scorching desert, clutching his dying baby in his arms, begging for just a drop of milk to save him. When he knocked on the door of a lonely cabin at the edge of town, he had no idea that moment would change both their lives forever. If this story moved you, leave a comment, hit like, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful tales. Don't stop here. Keep listening to find out what happened after she opened that door. Out in the sun-baked canyons of northern Arizona, where the wind carried whispers of sorrow and grit, lived a 23-year-old woman named Clara Rivera. With her mixed heritage and dark complexion, Clara never truly belonged to the nearby town of Red Bluff. Her skin shimmered like bronze beneath the desert sun, and her coal-black eyes carried the heavy sadness of someone who had lost more than her share. The log cabin she called home once belonged to her grandmother, Miss Eloise, a healer of Native and Mexican descent who'd raised Clara after an epidemic took her parents. Eloise had taught her about roots and herbs, the sacred rhythms of old prayers, and above all, compassion that knew no borders. Now Eloise rested beneath the cottonwood tree in the back, and Clara lived alone, facing the disdain of the townspeople each time she ventured into Red Bluff. Women crossed the street with their children when they saw her coming. "There goes that crazy half-breed," they muttered, casting wary glances her way. "They say she speaks with spirits, and her milk is cursed." Clara had long since learned to walk with her head high, but each word chipped away at the rawest wound inside her, the death of her own baby just 3 months earlier. Her son, whom she had named Lucas, was born of a night she'd forced herself to forget. No father. Just 6 brief months of breath and laughter before a fever stole him away. Since then, her body had stubbornly continued to produce milk, as though clinging to what was no longer there. Every day, that aching reminder haunted her. Then, one October afternoon, fate came riding on horseback. Clara had been gathering wild sage and bitterroot when she heard the unmistakable rhythm of hooves crunching gravel. She looked up and saw a tall man on a coal-black Mustang. His skin was sun-weathered, his black hair hung past his shoulders, and his shirt was dusted from the road. But what caught her attention wasn't his rugged stance or the way he held the reins. It was the bundle pressed close to his chest. The cowboy studied her for a long, silent moment, and she could see a desperation in his eyes that she understood all too well. Without a word, he dismounted and walked slowly toward her. He unwrapped the cloth bundle and revealed a baby no older than a few months. The child's lips were cracked, his face pale, and every shallow breath trembled with exhaustion. "Milk," the man said in broken English, his voice heavy with an unfamiliar accent. He gestured from the baby to Clara. "He needs milk." Her heart clenched. She didn't need to be told. The baby's sunken eyes and frail body screamed of severe dehydration. Without hesitation, she reached out and took the child into her arms. He was so light she feared he might shatter with a breath. "He's really sick," she murmured, glancing up at the man. "How long has he gone without feeding?" The cowboy didn't seem to fully grasp her words, but the fear in his eyes spoke volumes. Clara motioned for him to follow her inside. Inside the cabin, the hearth still glowed with the morning's fire. She gestured for him to sit, then examined the baby more closely. "Wes," he said quietly, placing a hand on his chest. Then, with a finger resting gently on the baby's brow, "Elijah." "My son." Clara nodded, touching her own chest. "Clara." Then she walked over to the rocking chair by the fireplace, holding the baby close. What had once felt numb inside her suddenly came alive. That buried maternal instinct surged up in her like a wave. She adjusted the baby in her arms and without further thought began to nurse him. Wes watched in silence, awe and gratitude mixing in his eyes. The panic that had clouded his face began to lift, replaced by something deeper, something raw and wordless. Elijah clung to her as though he had found salvation in her arms. Elijah clung to Clara with the fierce grip of someone who had found salvation at the edge of despair. For the next hour, Clara held the baby close and nursed him while Wes sat silently nearby, watching her every move. As Elijah finally drifted off to sleep full and calm, Clara felt a sense of peace wash over her, something she hadn't known in months. "Thank you," Wes murmured in rough, halting English. Then he added something in his native tongue, a few old cowboy words from his grandfather's side which Clara understood, thanks to what her grandmother had once taught her. "You saved my boy." Clara gently wrapped Elijah in a clean flannel blanket and handed him back. "He'll need to eat every few hours," she explained, using simple hand motions and bits of the old dialect she could still recall. "He's too weak. His mama—" Wes lowered his head. "Gone," he said quietly. "Raid. Soldiers." Clara's chest tightened. She knew all too well what it meant to lose the one person who anchored your heart. Without thinking, she reached over and touched his hand softly. "I'm sorry," she whispered. As Wes got ready to leave, Clara made a decision that would alter the course of her life. "Come back tomorrow," she said, gesturing clearly so he could understand. "Elijah still needs milk, and I still have milk." Wes stared at her with a gaze so intense it sent a chill down her spine. Slowly he nodded and swung up onto his horse. Before he turned to ride out, he placed a hand over his heart and stretched it toward her, a cowboy's sign of thanks and respect passed down from men of the plains. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. For the first time in ages, she felt like she mattered again, like her pain had a purpose. She had turned her grief into hope for someone more helpless than herself. And when the sun rose and she spotted Wes returning baby in arms, she understood that whatever path had brought them together wasn't by accident. What she didn't yet know was that this quiet act of compassion was about to spark a firestorm, one that would test not only her courage, but also the depth of her love. Word traveled fast in Red Bluff. It didn't take long before the townsfolk started whispering about Clara Rivera nursing the child of an outsider. Anger swelled especially among those who refused to see beyond their own prejudice. To them, she'd betrayed her own blood by helping the likes of Wes and his boy. A storm was brewing, one that threatened to destroy everything Clara had begun to heal. In the days that followed, a sacred rhythm settled into Clara's life. Every morning, just after first light, Wes would arrive with Elijah bundled in his arms. Bit by bit, the baby's cheeks regained their rosy glow, and his eyes sparkled with life again. Each feeding soothed not only the child, but Clara's own wounded heart. Wes didn't speak much, but his presence filled the cabin with a quiet strength she hadn't known she missed. He watched how she cared for Elijah with a devotion that couldn't be faked. Some afternoons, after the baby had fed and fallen asleep, they'd sit together in silence. No words were needed. A glance, a small nod, a shared moment said more than speech ever could. One evening, while Clara gently rocked Elijah in her arms, Wes began speaking in the soft, half-forgotten language of his roots. Clara didn't understand every word, but the gratitude in his tone, and something else, something deeper, reached her clearly. Their eyes met over the baby's head, and for a heartbeat time stood still. "You're a good mother," Wes said in hesitant English, the words thick on his tongue. Those simple words touched a place inside Clara she thought had long since gone numb. But the peace they'd found wasn't built to last. Red Bluff was a small town, and secrets didn't stay hidden for long. It was Martha, the town's laundry woman, who first caught sight of Wes leaving Clara's cabin early one morning. Her eyes widened at the unmistakable figure of a stranger, his boots, his coat, the way he moved. By midday, the whole town was buzzing. At Ramsey's saloon, the local watering hole, the men gathered around their usual table. At the head sat Randall Vaughn, a prosperous cattleman who fancied himself the town's moral compass. A man with a thick mustache, hard eyes, and a voice that dripped disdain every time he spoke about preserving the order of things. He slammed his fist on the table. That damn half-breed's feeding the whelp of some stray drifter, he spat. What's next? Letting the whole outlaw camp set up here. The other men grumbled their agreement. To them, cowboys like Wes, men who drifted in from who knows where, were little better than wolves sniffing around their fences. And Clara, by helping him, was nothing short of a traitor. We need to put a stop to this before it gets out of hand, muttered Earl, the blacksmith. My missus said she sees him coming around every morning. Who knows what he's really up to, maybe scouting for a raid. Not everyone in Red Bluff agreed. Reverend Joel, an aging preacher who had known Clara since she was a child, listened to the gossip with a growing sense of concern. He knew her heart. She wasn't reckless or wicked, just wounded and kind in ways others refused to see. That very afternoon, Reverend Joel paid a visit to Clara's place, wanting to see for himself. When he reached her cabin, he found Clara seated on the porch nursing Elijah while Wes whittled a small wooden toy with practiced hands. The scene was so peaceful, it reminded the Reverend of one of those biblical portraits, the Holy Family under the evening sky. Good afternoon, my child, he greeted her warmly. Clara looked up startled, but not fearful. Reverend Joel, she said, almost smiling. It's an honor. Wes rose instinctively, his hand drifting to the knife at his belt. But Clara gave him a calming glance and a subtle shake of her head. He's a friend, Clara said gently, her voice steady as she addressed Wes in the broken cowboy lingo her grandmother once taught her. A good man, a man of God. Reverend Joel watched their exchange closely, eyes filled with quiet curiosity. Looks like you found yourself a new kind of family, Clara. She adjusted baby Elijah in her arms, holding him close. I found something worth living for again, Reverend, she said softly. This child needed a mother, and I needed a son. I believe the good Lord brought them to my door. The old preacher stepped forward with care, and though Wes kept a guarded eye on him, he didn't show hostility. May I see the little one? Reverend Joel asked. Clara nodded, and he leaned down to get a look at Elijah's peaceful face. He's beautiful, the Reverend whispered. Every child is a gift from God, no matter where they come from. Those words were the first glimmer of hope in the storm that was about to roll over Red Bluff. Reverend Joel stayed nearly an hour longer speaking with Clara and doing his best to communicate with Wes through gestures and a handful of words he'd picked up from old trail riders and drifters. When it was time to leave, he took Clara's hands in his own. My child, he said solemnly. There are folks in this town who'll never understand what you're doing, but I see the love of Christ in it. Take care of this family that's been placed in your life. That night after Wes headed back to wherever he camped in the canyons, Clara felt a new fire burning in her chest. She knew the road ahead would be rough, but she was certain what she was doing was right. And 2 days later, her fears proved true when a group of local men, led by none other than Randall Vaughn, came riding up at dusk. Clara was just putting a pot of stew on the fire when she heard the heavy clatter of hooves closing in. Her heart pounded as she stepped out onto the porch to meet their hardened stares. Clara Rivera Randall barked as he dismounted. "We need to talk." She stood tall, doing her best to stay composed. "What can I do for you, gentlemen? We know exactly what you've been up to," spat Earl the blacksmith as he spat on the ground. "Feeding that mongrel's pup, turning your back on your own people." "That baby is innocent," Clara replied, her voice calm but firm. "He just needed milk to stay alive." "Cowboys like him are the enemy," Randall growled. "One of them gunned down my brother last year in a raid, and now you're feeding their brats, raising them so they can grow up and kill the rest of us." Clara felt the sting of his words like a slap. "Elijah's just a baby," she said. "He's not a threat to anyone. He'll grow up, won't he?" Randall snapped, stepping closer. "And when he does, he'll remember this town. He'll remember that a woman from Red Bluff gave him life. And he'll come back for blood." "If he comes back," Clara said quietly, but with more strength than she knew she had, "it'll be to say thank you. Love begets love, Mr. Vaughn. Only hate gives birth to hate." The men glanced at one another, confused and angry at her defiance. The thought of a cowboy showing gratitude seemed ridiculous to them. "You've got 3 days," Randall said flatly. 3 days to stop feeding that child and tell his father not to come back. Or we'll take matters into our own hands. Once they'd ridden off, Clara stood shaking for several minutes. But when she finally steadied herself, her resolve was stronger than ever. She had found a family in Wes and Elijah, and she wasn't about to give them up because of the hatred of men too blind to see the truth. That evening, when Wes came for Elijah's feeding, she told him everything. His jaw clenched at the threats, his fists balling at his sides. "I can leave," he said, his voice quiet but heavy. "I don't want them hurting you." Clara took his hand and held it tight. "No," she said. "You're my family now. Elijah is my son. No one's going to tear us apart." In that moment, as they looked down at the baby sleeping peacefully between them, they both realized something had shifted. What they shared had grown stronger than any line drawn by skin or culture. They had found something deeper than fear. They had found love. The 3 days Randall Vaughn had given passed slowly, every hour soaked in tension. Clara kept nursing Elijah with the same care as before, but now every sound from outside set her on edge. Wes started arriving earlier and staying longer, as if he could sense danger closing in. On the 4th day, the air turned still in a way that warned of trouble. Red Bluff looked quiet, but Clara could feel the storm brewing just beneath the surface. The glances women gave her at the general store had sharpened, and men stopped talking when she passed. The very wind seemed heavy with unspoken judgment. That evening, as Clara rocked Elijah to sleep, Wes stepped to the window with a grim expression. His instincts, honed from years of riding and surviving in harsh land, had picked up something she couldn't yet feel. "They're coming," he muttered, eyes narrowed. He turned to her. "There's a lot of them. We need to go." Clara's blood ran cold. She stood up, baby in her arms, and peered through the window. In the distance, she saw torches flickering like angry fireflies in the dark. The pounding of hooves and shouting voices rolled through the night like thunder from an oncoming storm. "We've got to move," Wes said, already grabbing the supplies he always kept ready just in case. Clara looked around her home, the little cabin where she'd grown into a woman, where joy and heartbreak had shaped her into who she was. For a moment, the thought of standing her ground flickered inside her. But then she looked down at Elijah's innocent sleeping face and knew some things were more important than pride. "Let's go," Clara whispered, wrapping Elijah snugly in the warmest blanket she had. They slipped out the back door just as the first torches began to flicker down the main trail. Wes led her into the woods where he'd stashed his horse among the trees. The shouts of the men grew louder when they found the cabin empty. "Search every damn inch," bellowed Randall Vaughn. They couldn't have gotten far. Clara clung to Elijah as Wes helped her up onto the saddle. The baby, as if sensing the danger, stayed silent against her chest. They rode without a word, guided only by the moonlight and Wes's deep knowledge of the terrain. The journey into the mountains was quiet, but heavy with fear. The days that followed were some of the hardest of Clara's life. Wes led her to a hidden cave he'd used before while drifting from place to place. It was dry and secure, but nothing like the comfort of home, and Clara couldn't stop herself from silently weeping the first few nights. But soon, despair gave way to something else: respect. Wes moved through the wilderness like it was part of him. He knew where to find clean water, which plants could be eaten, how to light a fire that wouldn't give off smoke. Patiently, he began teaching Clara these survival skills. "The land don't owe us nothing," he told her while showing how to dig up wild roots. "But if you treat her right, she might just let you live." Clara picked things up quickly. Her late grandmother Eloise had taught her about herbs and healing, and now that knowledge blended seamlessly with what Wes was passing on. Each day, Clara felt stronger, more confident in the life they were building together. Elijah was thriving. The boy had begun to smile small, sweet grins that lit up the cave like sunshine. Clara would nurse him while watching the golden sunsets stretch endlessly across the horizon, wrapped in a peace she'd never felt back in Red Bluff. Wes was a quiet teacher and a steady companion. At night, once Elijah was asleep, he'd carve little wooden toys by the fire or tend to his worn gear while Clara sewed baby clothes from scraps she'd packed before fleeing. Sometimes they sat for hours without speaking, but the silence between them felt warm, never empty. Over time, Clara realized her feelings for Wes had grown into something far deeper than gratitude. It was the way he cared for Elijah, how he protected her without making her feel helpless, the way his eyes softened when they looked into hers. Something in all of it stirred a love inside her that she hadn't thought herself capable of again. One evening, as they sat at the cave entrance watching stars blaze across the dark sky, Wes broke their usual silence. "There's this story I heard once," he said slowly, "about a woman who took in a hurt raven. She fed it, kept it warm, helped it heal. And when it could fly again, it soared up into the sky and asked the spirits to give her joy that'd never end." Clara turned toward him, curious. What happened to her? Wes looked straight ahead, eyes glinting in the starlight. The spirits told her she could have happiness, or safety, but not both. He turned to meet her gaze. She picked happiness, and lived a full life until the day she joined the stars. Clara understood. Sitting beside him with Elijah asleep between them and the mountains holding back the world's cruelty, she knew she too had chosen joy over certainty. "I don't regret it," she murmured, and felt Wes reach for her hand. But that fragile peace wasn't meant to last. Randall Vaughn and his men had begun scouring the mountains, offering rewards to anyone who'd reveal the whereabouts of the traitor and her outlaw. Some bounty hunters and peddlers hungry for cash started talking. It was Tom Keller, an old trapper who'd once traded herbs with Clara's grandmother, who finally gave them away. He'd spotted smoke from their hidden fire and tracked the signs to the cave. Guilt gnawed at him, but he needed the money to keep his own kids fed. One morning, while Clara was nursing Elijah and Wes was checking his snares, the pounding of hooves shattered the quiet. Wes ran back to the cave, but it was too late. They were surrounded. "Come on out!" Clara. Randall's voice roared from outside. "We know you're in there!" Wes grabbed his bow and arrows, ready to fight. But Clara reached out and touched his arm. "No," she whispered. "I won't let them hurt you. Elijah still needs you. I need you too." Wes said, his voice low and thick with emotion enough to shake her heart. Before she could answer, the men outside began hurling torches toward the cave's mouth. Smoke rolled in fast. Elijah started crying, his tiny sobs swallowed by the roar of flames and shouting. Clara knew what she had to do. With trembling hands, she bundled Elijah tightly in his blanket and placed him into Wes's arms. "Take care of our son," she said, using the word "our" for the first time. "There's another way out in the back. Go. Keep him safe." "I'm not leaving you," Wes insisted, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You have to," Clara said through tears that clung to her lashes. "He's what matters now. Promise me you'll keep him safe." Wes looked at her with a kind of pain that carved itself deep into his face. Slowly he nodded and took Elijah into his arms. Just before slipping toward the narrow escape tunnel in the back of the cave, he turned one last time. "I'll find you," he promised. "No matter what happens, I'll come back for you." Clara stepped out of the cave, hands raised, coughing as smoke stung her throat and eyes. The men swarmed in as soon as they saw her, some wearing smug grins, others barely masking their shame. "Where's the cowboy?" barked Randall Vaughn. He left Clara lied calmly. "Days ago." Randall struck her across the face with the back of his hand, her mouth filled with the sharp taste of blood. "Liar," he growled. "We know he was here. We'll find his trail." But Wes knew those mountains better than any man from town. By the time the search parties organized, he and Elijah had vanished into the vast, unforgiving landscape like smoke on the wind. They tied Clara's hands and dragged her back to Red Bluff as if she were some wanted criminal. She walked tall, refusing to let them see her fear, though inside her chest, her heart cracked with every thought of Elijah. Was Wes able to find goat's milk? Was Elijah crying now, wondering why she wasn't there to hold him? Word of Clara's capture spread through town like prairie fire. When they reached the square, a crowd had already gathered. The women stared at her with a blend of morbid curiosity and quiet satisfaction, while the men hurled insults she refused to acknowledge. "Traitor," shouted Mrs. Carmody, the mayor's wife. "How dare you feed the snake that'll strike our children?" Randall Vaughn had prepared a makeshift cell in the basement of his home. It was cold and damp, barely lit by a sliver of sunlight through a tiny barred window. They gave her stale bread and water, but Clara barely touched it. Her body still produced milk for Elijah, a cruel reminder that her child, though not by blood, was far away and in need. The days in that cell dragged like a cruel sentence. Her body ached not just from the physical pain, but from the empty hollowness left by Elijah's absence. Her arms remembered the rhythm of cradling him, her heart, the softness of his gaze. She wondered whether Wes had found a way to feed him, if Elijah was still strong, if she'd ever see his dark, trusting eyes again. Randall came to her every day, not out of kindness, but to squeeze her for information. How many of his kind are hiding in the hills he'd demand, pacing like a wolf around her? Where's their camp? What are they planning? Clara kept her lips sealed. Each silence infuriated him more. "Your silence won't save you," he hissed. "The men around here are getting restless. Some say we ought to drag you into the desert and let you feel what real thirst is like." But Clara had discovered a strength she didn't know she had. Every threat, every sneer only carved her resolve deeper. She had done the right thing, saved a child, loved a man worth loving, built a family not with blood, but with courage and grace. Nothing they did could take that away. Meanwhile, Wes was living his own hell in the mountains. Elijah wouldn't take the goat's milk he'd struggled to find. The baby cried constantly, growing weaker with each passing night. His tiny frame thinned, and his cries grew faint and desperate. Wes's heart broke with every sound. Each night he crept down toward Red Bluff under the cover of darkness, watching the Vaughn house from the trees. He studied the guards, the doors, the patterns. Dozens of plans ran through his mind, but every one led to bloodshed, and Clara had taught him there were better ways than revenge. One night, holding Elijah feverish and limp in his arms, Wes made a desperate choice. He bundled the baby in his best blankets, mounted his horse, and rode into town, not to fight, but to beg. He rode straight to the church, knowing Reverend Joel would be there. The old preacher was in the middle of his nightly prayers when a soft knock came at the sacristy door. When he opened it, he found Wes standing there holding a child who was clearly dying. He didn't need to say a word. His face told the story. "He's fading without her," Wes said in broken English, pain roughening his voice. "He needs his mama." Reverend Joel took the baby in his arms. Elijah's skin was hot to the touch, and his once bright eyes were now glassy and dull. The child was slipping away without Clara's milk, without her warmth. "This is the devil's work," the Reverend muttered, not about the baby, but about the cruelty of men who would tear a mother from her child. "Come with me, son," he said firmly. "It's time someone in this town remembered what real Christian mercy looks like." With Wes trailing behind at a cautious distance, the Reverend strode straight toward Randall Vaughn's house. The guards blinked in shock at the sight of the preacher at such an hour, and even more at who followed him. "Preacher, you can't bring him here," one stammered, glaring at Wes as though he were a disease. "This man isn't here to cause harm," Reverend Joel said firmly, his voice carrying a weight that made folks stop and listen. "He came to save his child's life. And I came to remind you all that Jesus taught us to care for the weak and the helpless." Randall Vaughn appeared in the doorway, roused by the commotion outside. At the sight of Wes, his sleepy scowl twisted into outright rage. "How dare you bring that stray mutt onto my property?" he barked. "That mutt, as you call him." Reverend Joel replied calmly. "Lifting the fevered baby in his arms is a desperate father. And this child is dying because you've torn him away from the only mother he's ever known. Is that what you call Christian justice?" By now, townsfolk had begun to gather, drawn by the heated voices. Among them was Mrs. Esther Whitlow, an elderly midwife who had delivered more babies in Red Bluff than anyone could count. The moment her eyes landed on the sickly infant, something inside her snapped awake. "Sweet Lord above," she murmured, rushing closer. "This child's burning up. Look how pale he is, his eyes shining with fever." "He's just a cowboy's brat," Randall muttered coldly. "Let him die, one less troublemaker for us to deal with down the line." His words fell like stones into a pond, sending ripples of discomfort even through his most loyal supporters. The idea of letting a baby die just to make a point didn't sit right even in their hardened hearts. "Since when do we treat a child like an enemy?" Esther snapped fire in her eyes. When did it become acceptable to punish the innocent for the sins of their elders? Reverend Joel seized the moment. "Let Clara see him," he urged. "Let her nurse this child. If you still wish to judge her afterward, so be it. But don't let a baby die just to prove a point." Randall shifted uncomfortably. Turning down a preacher's request in front of the whole town, especially with Esther Whitlow and a growing crowd of women watching, was a risky move. 5 minutes, he finally relented. Under strict watch. And if that cowboy makes one wrong move, we shoot first. They led Reverend Joel and Wes down into the cold, damp cellar where Clara had been locked away. When she saw the preacher step through the doorway, followed by Wes holding Elijah, she froze. For a moment she thought she was dreaming, but the baby's weak cries pulled her straight into reality. "My boy," she whispered, arms outstretched. Wes gently handed Elijah to her. She pressed the baby against her chest and instantly felt the heat radiating from his tiny body. Without hesitation or shame, she shifted him into position and began to nurse him right there in front of everyone. Elijah latched on with the desperation of someone who had found water in a desert. "He's been real sick," Wes said quietly. "Wouldn't take anything else. He needs you." Tears streamed down Clara's cheeks as she cradled his frail body, watching his breathing slow and the color begin to return to his cheeks. "I'm here, sweetheart," she whispered. "Mama's here now." The guard standing nearby couldn't help but be moved. There was something raw and universal in that moment, a mother feeding her child, no matter who was watching. Even Randall Vaughn, for all his bluster, looked like something had cracked inside him. As Elijah continued to feed, the signs of life returning to him were undeniable. The flush in his cheeks, the steadier rise and fall of his little chest. Even the most skeptical observers had to admit that baby wouldn't make it without Clara. "This child will die without her," Mrs. Whitlow said, standing firm. "She may not be his mother by blood, but in every way that counts, she is." Reverend Joel nodded. "A mother's love doesn't care about race or roots. This woman is showing us the purest form of Christian love." But when the time came to pull Elijah away again, the child let out a piercing, heart-wrenching cry. His sobs echoed up through the floorboards and out into the street where more townspeople had gathered. The sound sliced through the crowd like a knife, awakening a primal instinct in every parent, every human being within earshot. "We can't keep doing this," Mrs. Whitlow declared, her voice resolute. "That child needs his mother, and she's proven to be one in every sense that matters." Randall bristled. "She's a traitor," he snapped. "She helped our enemy. She helped a baby who couldn't fend for himself," Reverend Joel corrected. "And if that's treason, then everything Christ taught us about love and mercy must be too." The air hung thick with tension. The town stood divided, some beginning to see the humanity in Clara's actions, others clinging desperately to old fears and hate. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and like all powerful truths, it would grow no matter how hard some tried to bury it. That night, as Clara was led back to her cell, and Wes slipped quietly into the darkness of the hills with a now stabilized Elijah in his arms, they both understood something had shifted. The truth had found a crack in the wall of ignorance, and it was pushing through. And like all truths worth telling, it wouldn't stop until it changed everything in its path. The image of Clara nursing the cowboy's baby had been seared into the memories of many in Red Bluff, especially the women who were mothers themselves. Esther Whitlow, the town's seasoned midwife, began quietly visiting other women in their homes, gently sowing seeds of doubt about the morality of separating a child from the only mother he knew. "I've seen more births than I can count," she'd say, as they sat in afternoon quilting circles. And I swear the love I saw in that girl's eyes is the same love I've seen in every one of you the first time you held your babies. A mother's heart doesn't know race or boundary. Meanwhile, Reverend Joel had started his own silent but effective campaign from the pulpit. His Sunday sermons spoke more and more of compassion, of standing beside the weak, of how Christ embraced all of God's creation without prejudice. He never named Clara or the situation directly, but everyone in town could hear it in his message. And it wasn't lost on Randall Vaughn that his grip on the town was loosening. Even some of his most loyal followers had started to question whether Clara's punishment had gone too far. The cruel remark he'd made about letting the baby die had backfired, haunting him now in whispers and sidelong glances. The mothers of Red Bluff couldn't shake the image of a starving child paying the price for adult hatred. But the most unexpected shift came from a place no one anticipated. Wes, desperate over Elijah's worsening condition, without Clara made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable weeks earlier. He went to ask for help. He rode deep into the high plains back to the scattered homestead where his estranged father, Marshall Nash, lived. Nash was a grizzled old cattleman who'd survived border wars, droughts, and raids, and now led a group of cowboys and homesteaders too proud to bow to town politics. When Wes arrived with the sick child and told him everything, Nash listened in heavy silence, his weathered eyes taking in every word. "This woman," Wes said, voice cracking, "she risked everything for our son. She ain't blood, but she's family," the old man finally said. "She's done what most folks wouldn't dare. She stood for the right thing even when the world turned its back on her. But they got her locked up in Red Bluff," Wes added, his voice breaking. "And without her, Elijah won't make it." Nash looked down at his grandson, his pale cheeks, his shallow breaths, and clenched his jaw. "A child like this shouldn't have to die 'cause men are too proud to see the truth. But we won't go in with guns drawn," Nash added. "That only leads to more pain. We ride in as men of peace." He gathered a group of 15 riders, tough, leather-skinned cowboys who'd once fought beside him and trusted his judgment. When he told them about Clara, about what she'd done, and the hate she was facing, many were surprised, but none objected. "A woman who'd feed a child that ain't hers in a world like this," Nash said. "That ain't just rare, it's holy." 3 days later, a line of horseback riders appeared on the horizon of Red Bluff. They didn't carry rifles or pistols slung across their chests. Instead, they bore ceremonial staffs, folded wool blankets, and open hands. Nash rode at the front, upright and calm, his reputation strong enough to make even the boldest townsman hesitate. Beside him rode Wes, holding Elijah, who was visibly weak. Panic rippled through Red Bluff. Mothers snatched up their children and bolted indoors. Men scrambled for their rifles. But as the riders didn't attack, only rode steadily to the town square and waited, the fear slowly gave way to curiosity. Randall Vaughn emerged from his home with a posse behind him, guns at the ready. But he froze when he saw Nash dismount, calmly, hands raised to show he meant no harm. "I came to talk," Nash said, his voice low but clear. "I came for the woman who saved my grandson's life." "There's nothing to discuss," Randall barked, though a slight tremble betrayed him. He had never stood this close to so many hard men without being in charge. "There's plenty to discuss," Nash said evenly. "That woman showed more decency than most folks I've known. She gave her heart and her body to save a child that wasn't hers. That deserves respect, not chains." Reverend Joel stepped through the crowd at that moment, recognizing the turning tide. "Mr. Vaughn," he said loud enough for everyone to hear, "these men came in peace." And as Christians, it is our duty to listen when peace knocks. Mrs. Whitlow joined them, flanked by other women who'd been swayed by her quiet campaign. Her eyes fell on Elijah in Wes's arms, pale and feverish. "That baby's fading fast," she murmured, and those around her could feel the weight of her words. Nash scanned the faces of the townspeople. He'd seen enough over the years to know when hearts were beginning to shift. And this town, this hard, broken place, was on the edge of something it didn't yet understand. "My people and yours have fought each other for generations," Nash said, turning his voice toward the entire crowd now gathered in the square. "We've lost sons, fathers, and brothers on both sides. But this woman showed us there's another way. She didn't see a threat. She saw a child in need, and she became the mother he needed. Not an enemy, but a child of God." The words of the old cowboy chief, especially his mention of God, struck deep with many in the crowd. Reverend Joel seized the moment. "This man speaks a truth that we as followers of Christ ought to recognize," he declared. "Didn't the Lord tell us to love even our enemies? Didn't he call on us to care for the least among us?" Randall Vaughn felt the tide shifting against him. His grip on the crowd was slipping. "They're our enemies," he shouted. "They've taken our people, and you've taken theirs," Nash replied, his voice steady, not angry, just full of grief. "But my grandson hasn't taken anything from anyone. He's just a baby, and he needs his mother. And that mother is locked in your jail." Wes stepped forward, holding Elijah close. The baby let out a faint, broken cry that sliced through the stillness like a blade. "He's my son," Wes said, his voice cracking. "He's dying without her. Clara is his mother in every way that matters. She saved him when I couldn't." Esther Whitlow couldn't stay silent anymore. She stepped forward, arms outstretched. "May I?" she asked gently. Wes hesitated, then handed the baby to her. With the practiced touch of a lifelong midwife, she examined the child. Her face paled. "He's severely dehydrated and underfed," she announced to the crowd. "If he doesn't get proper nourishment soon, he's not going to make it." She turned to Randall, eyes brimming with emotion. "Are you really going to let a baby die just to prove you're right?" Her words echoed in the uneasy silence. Several women began to cry. Even the men, some of them Randall's closest allies, shifted uncomfortably, unable to look away from the suffering infant. And then something no one expected happened. Maria Randall's teenage daughter pushed through the crowd. She had been watching everything from the upstairs window of their home, and the sight of the sick child had shaken something loose in her. "Papa," she said, her voice trembling but firm, "you can't let that baby die. That's not what Mama would have wanted." The mention of his late wife hit Randall like a punch to the gut. She had been a kind woman, one who cared for orphans and took in strays without hesitation. For the first time in weeks, doubt clouded his eyes. Reverend Joel stepped forward again. "Mr. Vaughn," he said gently, "you have the chance right now to show what true Christian strength looks like. Not the kind that comes from guns or fear, but the kind that comes from mercy and grace." Nash added, "If you let this woman go, my people will remember this act of decency. We can talk peace between us. We can teach our children there's another way besides bloodshed." The square fell into a hush, thick with tension. Every eye turned to Randall. He looked at his daughter, at the hopeful faces of the town's women, at the baby barely clinging to life in Esther's arms, and finally at the preacher. "3 months," he said at last, his voice rough and low. 3 months of peace. If there's no trouble, no betrayal, I'll consider a permanent truce." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Nash nodded solemnly. "You have our word. No man from my camp will raise a hand against this town as long as she's treated with dignity." When they finally opened Clara's cell, she blinked against the sudden light, unable to believe what she was seeing. Wes was already there with Elijah, and when the baby saw her, his cries turned into sobs of relief. "My boy," Clara whispered, scooping him into her arms. "Mama's here now." The reunion was so heartfelt, so raw, that even the toughest cowhands had to look away, blinking against the tears welling in their eyes. Elijah clung to her like he'd never let go again, and Clara, without care for the eyes watching, nursed him right there in the center of the square. Nash stepped forward, and with quiet reverence removed his hat and bowed his head before her. "You're a real mother," he said, and then repeated it louder so all could hear. "Our people honor you." In the months that followed, life in Red Bluff began to shift. Clara, Wes, and Elijah settled in a small house on the edge of town where they lived in peace, watched over by both Nash's riders and the townsfolk who'd once doubted them. Elijah grew strong and bright, his laughter bridging the gap between two worlds. He spoke both English and the slow drawl of the prairie men who raised him, and every step he took softened hearts that had once been hard as rock. The same women who once whispered behind Clara's back now came to her porch for advice on herbs, on child rearing, and sometimes just to sit quietly in her calming presence. The past hadn't been erased, but it had been healed, one act of love at a time. Reverend Joel presided over the union of Clara and Wes in a one-of-a-kind ceremony that blended Christian vows with cowboy frontier tradition. It was the first interracial wedding Red Bluff had ever witnessed, and though a few townsfolk raised their brows, far more celebrated it as a symbol of unity and a new beginning. Randall Vaughn changed deeply. By all he had seen, became an unlikely voice for peace in the region. His daughter Maria grew close to Colt Wes's younger brother, forging a friendship that hinted at a brighter future, one built on mutual respect rather than fear. Years passed, and Elijah, once a fragile infant, now ran freely with the other children of Red Bluff, no longer marked by the lines of race or history. In the evenings, Clara often sat on the front porch of their small home on the outskirts of town, gazing out at the rugged mountains that had once sheltered her and gifted her love. Wes would be beside her, carving little wooden toys for their boy, while watching Elijah laugh and chase butterflies among the wildflowers. "Do you ever regret any of it?" Wes asked softly, one sunset slipping his hand into hers. Clara looked out at the horizon, then at the family fate had placed in her arms, and smiled. "Not for a second," she answered. "True love's always worth the price." Above them the sky glowed in hues of amber and crimson, like heaven itself was blessing a family not bound by blood, but built on courage, kindness, and unconditional love. Elijah came running toward them with his arms wide open, giggling as he leapt into their embrace. And in that quiet, golden moment, Clara knew she'd found where she belonged. Not as the outcast of a dusty town, but as a mother, a wife, and a bridge between worlds. The story of Clara, Wes, and Elijah became legend across the plains, retold by generations, as a testament that love can overcome even the deepest divides, and that a real family is born not from bloodlines, but from the choices we make to love fiercely and do right by one another. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to our channel for more stories like this one.